A missing mince pie stirs up quiet trouble in Lochdu, drawing Hamish Macbeth into a small but curious mystery. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. The slush outside the Kirk Hall had turned to a grey paste by the time Hamish Macbeth pushed the heavy door shut behind him. The wind followed him in like a scold, scraping along the floor before dying against the radiator. He wiped his boots on the mat, though it did not help much. The place was already crowded with damp footprints and the sort of strained cheer people forced on themselves when they meant to be charitable. Tables ran in uneven rows, each one groaning with scones and trays of biscuits and uneven cakes that leaned to one side. The smell of sugar sat thick in the air, mixed with the wool smell of wet coats. Someone had hung a few garlands across the rafters. They sagged as if repenting it. Hamish stood by the main door, hands in his pockets. He had been ordered to keep an eye on the flow of people by the minister's wife. She said it in the sort of tone that suggested he would otherwise ruin something. Sonsie had been locked in the Land Rover after giving a very pointed glare at a tray of sausage rolls. Lugs lay under the trestle table nearest to Hamish, paws tucked under his chest, watching ankles with the intensity of a magistrate. The dog's ears flicked whenever someone's voice rose. Hamish wished he could do the same and leave. There was no room to breathe. Mrs. McLean's mince pie had sat, on the centre table, raised on a little stand covered in lace. Folk had been shuffling around it for the last half hour, remarking on the glaze and the crimping and the smell of good fruit, as if Morag were about to be awarded a peerage. She herself hovered close by, hands twisting her handbag strap. Hamish liked Morag well enough, though she had a sharp tongue when it suited her. The minister's wife, Mrs. Campbell, tapped a spoon on a glass. The chatter in the hall dropped unevenly. Some kept talking out of stubbornness. She cleared her throat. "A wee moment of thanks," she said, "to all who have baked, given, or helped in any small way." Several people shuffled to stand straighter. Hamish felt one shoulder of his uniform jacket slip and tugged it up again. "And," she went on, "a special welcome to the guests from Tommel Castle Hotel, who will be sampling Mrs. McLean's famous mince pie later. We do hope they will." She turned with a flourish toward the centrepiece. Her words stopped mid-air. Her hand trembled once, then fell flat against the table. The silver plate was empty. Only the lace doily remained, scrunched and speckled with crumbs. A streak of mincemeat smudged across one side like a poor joke. Someone laughed. A loud, foolish bark that echoed off the damp walls. It died almost instantly. Heads craned in. Morag's face drained of colour so quickly Hamish thought she might faint. "It was there a minute ago," she said. Her voice tipped into a shrill edge. "It was right there." The murmuring swelled at once. Villagers stepping back, villagers leaning in. Patel saying sharply that none of his staff had gone near the tables. His nephew making a noise somewhere between agreement and fear. A tourist woman with a tartan scarf muttered, "Typical, isn't it? First sight I've had of local baking, and it's vanished." Hamish moved forward, though he felt the usual reluctance drag at him. He bent to inspect the table. The crumbs were too few. Whoever had taken the pie had not eaten it here. Lugs crawled out from under the trestle and stood, his tail lowered, his ears stiffened toward the back door. "Ah, keep your hair on," Hamish muttered to the dog. Still, he followed the line of Lugs's stare. One of the side doors, the one seldom used except by folk sneaking in late, stood slightly ajar. A sliver of cold air slid through the opening. Mrs. Campbell fussed beside him. "Constable Macbeth, do say something reassuring." "It's only a pie," Hamish said. The phrase sounded weak even to him. Several heads turned at once, disbelieving. Maybe someone moved it. "Moved it?" Morag's voice cracked. "For what? A joke?" She stared at him with a mixture of hurt and accusation, as if he were expected to drag the thief out by the collar. He felt his cheeks warm. He stepped toward the side door. The floorboards were scattered with boots marks, but that meant little. Near the threshold, though, something small caught his eye, a scrap of bright red. He crouched and picked it up. It was a torn piece of ribbon, the same kind tied to the prize cards for best baking. He straightened and looked out into the raw air. No one stood outside. Only the wind drifted across the muddy ground. Behind him the commotion grew louder. Patel defended himself again. Someone accused Morag of misplacing her own pie. Another insisted a tourist child had grabbed it. Mrs. McGregor said she had seen a shadow passing the window, but could not be sure it wasn't her own reflection. Hamish turned and walked back inside. "It didn't walk off," he said, mostly to himself. But Morag heard him, and the sharp tilt of her head showed she clung to the words. The minister's wife attempted to carry on the fete. People bought oatcakes and jam jars with the enthusiasm of condemned prisoners. No one wanted to look at Morag. She stood rigid beside the empty stand, staring at the doily as if it had betrayed her. Hamish stayed near the door. It felt safer there. A few guests forced themselves to speak to him. "So, Constable," said a stout man from Edinburgh, "do pies often vanish in Lochdu? Part of the local charm, is it?" "No," Hamish said shortly. "Well, that's disappointing." Hamish ignored him after that. A crofter from the edges of the village sidled up and said, "My wife baked that pie last year. Didn't win a thing. Funny how Morag's goes missing just as she's to get attention." Hamish looked at the crofter's narrow face. He looked away again. Folk were quicker to remark spite than kindness. Lugs pressed close to his leg. The dog's weight shifted from foot to foot, nervous. Hamish scratched the rough fur at his ears, though his own nerves felt prickly. After another half hour, the fate sagged into a weary drift of polite farewells and bags of unwanted cookies. The minister thanked Hamish for his presence, which sounded like a criticism. Mrs. Campbell said the loss of the pie would need to be addressed, which meant she expected him to fix everything. Morag cornered him as he made to leave. Her eyes were wet but furious. "You find out who did this," she said. "My pie was for the hotel critic. People were counting on it." "I'll do what I can," Hamish said. "You'd better. Lochdu will be the talk of the county if this gets out." Hamish said nothing. It already would be, and she knew it. Outside, the air had grown colder. Sonsie pressed her face against the Land Rover window, indignant and hungry. Hamish let her out. She stalked away with her tail high as if the entire fate had insulted her personally. He walked home with Lugs beside him. The dog kept glancing back toward the Kirk Hall, uneasy. Hamish wished he could blame the dog's nerves on the weather, but he felt the same prickle under his skin. Someone in Lochdu had done something foolish or spiteful or both. Folk would talk. By nightfall the story would have turned twice and sprouted thorns. Someone would whisper that Morag poisoned her own pie. Someone else would say a stranger had slipped in. Someone would blame Patel's nephew. Someone would blame Hamish. He let himself into the station. The peat fire had burned low. He poked it half-heartedly. Flames rose with a dull sigh. "A missing pie," he said aloud. "That's all." But the scrap of red ribbon sat in his pocket like a small, stubborn truth. Someone had walked off with a whole mince pie in full view of half the village. Someone had thought that amusing or clever. And tomorrow the minister would want answers, and villagers would expect justice, and Strathbane would laugh or scold or both. Hamish sat down heavily on the wooden chair. Lugs curled up at his feet, already calmer, though the fire popped sharply now and then. "It's only a pie," Hamish said again. It did not feel like only a pie. Hamish knew something was wrong the moment he cracked the first egg. The bacon in the pan hissed in a sour, impatient way, as if it blamed him for the cold morning creeping through the window. Lug sat by the stove, stiff and alert, staring toward the door as though bad news were already trying to get in. The phone rang. It had that particular Strathbane rattle that made Hamish's shoulders tighten before he even lifted the receiver. "Macbeth," he said. Daviot's voice came down the line, sharp and pinched as if he had not thawed since last winter. "Finally. Macbeth, we have a situation. The food critic from the city, Alistair Craig, collapsed last night at Tommel Castle Hotel. Collapsed, Macbeth. Do you understand?" Hamish poked the bacon with the edge of the spatula. "Aye, sir. Shame for him." "Shame? Shame?" Daviot snapped. He mentioned something before he took ill. Something about a queer-tasting mince pie from some village hall. "Would that be your village hall, Macbeth? Lochdu?" Hamish closed his eyes for a moment. Lugs let out a low whine. "Could be, sir," he said. "There was a fete yesterday. Lots of food passed around. Folk take that sort of thing seriously." "Clearly too seriously," Daviot said. "The hotel is trying to keep this quiet, but if the press hears that a critic collapsed after eating some homemade nonsense from your village—" "It was Morag MacLean's pie," Hamish muttered. "She's proud of it." "Your pride does not concern me. Get on top of it before someone else does. I want a full report by this afternoon. If Macbeth bungles it," Hamish heard the rustle of paper, "you may expect a reassignment, somewhere less sentimental." The line went dead. Hamish hung up the phone and looked at the frying pan. The bacon was burned. The room smelled of defeat. He did not even have time to scrape the pan before he heard the growl of a squad car engine outside, followed by the slam of 2 doors. Lugs went rigid, ears straight up. Hamish felt the same way. Blair marched into the station as though he had been waiting all night for this moment. His coat was unbuttoned, scarf hanging loose, cheeks red with triumph rather than cold. Anderson hovered behind him, taking notes before anything was even said. "Well, Macbeth," Blair said, tossing his gloves on the desk, "you've outdone yourself, letting the heathens poison a distinguished guest. A critic, no less. Oh, they'll love this in headquarters." "No one poisoned anyone," Hamish said. "No one even knows what he ate." "I know what he ate," Blair said. "A village pie, from your precious wee fate." He rolled the word fate around his mouth like something sour. "And now the man's in hospital. Tell me, Macbeth, do you think he'll write about his experience? A rustic evening in Lochdu complete with attempted murder." Hamish felt heat rise in his face. "There's no proof the pie did anything. Folk get ill from overeating, from whiskey, from a cold draught if they're delicate enough." "And you should know all about delicacy," Blair sneered. "You going soft on your pals as usual." Hamish ignored that. "I'll look into it quietly." "No," Blair said, grabbing his gloves again. "You'll look into it properly, or I'll remove you from the case. Maybe permanently. Anderson, note that down." Anderson scribbled with an eagerness that would have looked foolish on a child. Blair swung back toward the door. "We'll start at Patel's shop. No doubt some comical mix-up with the staff, or maybe not so comical." Hamish followed reluctantly. The village street was still glazed with black ice, the cold sinking straight through his boots. A few villagers were already gathering near the shop window, drawn by Blair's booming approach. Patel stood behind the counter, jaw set tight. A few customers lurked, pretending to study the tins. "Well then," Blair announced as if addressing a theatre audience, "we require full cooperation from the community. A mince pie has gone missing, and now a man lies ill. This is a police matter." The customers leaned forward. Patel stiffened further. "My shop had nothing to do with any missing pie," he said, smiling thinly. "My nephew didn't go near the Kirk Hall yesterday. You know that, Constable Macbeth." Hamish opened his mouth, but Blair cut in. "We'll see about that. First, I'll need a list of everyone who handled food at the fete." Morag, who had just entered with a parcel under her arm, stopped dead. "Handled?" she repeated. "Why would you need that?" Blair took out a notebook as though performing for a slow audience. "Standard procedure when poison is suspected." Morag went white. "Poison? My baking never harmed a soul." Blair wrote something dramatically. "Defensive response. Interesting." "It's not interesting," Hamish said. "It's embarrassing, and you're jumping to conclusions." Blair turned on him. "You'll keep quiet unless spoken to. This is serious. A public figure has fallen ill. If Macbeth chooses to protect his wee friends instead of doing his job, I'll see him off this case." At that, the shop grew painfully silent. Villagers stared at Hamish, waiting to see if he'd squirm. He did not, though he felt the weight of their eyes pressing on him. Patel cleared his throat. "Surely we should wait for facts, Sergeant." "Facts?" Blair barked. "Oh, we'll get facts. And if Mrs. McLean," he pointed at Morag, "can't explain where her pie went, she may have a lot to answer for." Morag's face pinched. "It was stolen, that's all. Ask anyone who saw the haul." Stolen pie. Quite the crime." Blair flicked his pen at Anderson. "Write that. Suspect claims theft." Hamish felt a flare of anger but kept it buried. He could almost hear Daviot's warning buzzing behind his ear. A tourist woman in a bright jacket stepped forward. "Was it really a mince pie from here that sickened that man? We were thinking of trying the cafe." Patel stiffened. "Our food is perfectly safe." "Didn't say it wasn't," she said, though she sounded pleased to stir things. Hamish wanted to tell them all to go home and stop acting as if the village would crumble over one pie, but that would only give Blair more ammunition. Instead, he muttered, "This is getting out of hand." Blair heard him. "Out of hand is your specialty, Macbeth. Now get moving. Interview the critic's wife. She's still at the hotel. I want her statement today." Hamish left the shop feeling as if he'd been rolled in dust. Lugs, who had waited outside, pressed close to his leg, uneasy from all the raised voices. At Tommel Castle Hotel, the air was warmer, but no more friendly. Craig's wife, a thin woman with sharp eyes, sat in the lounge with a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink. "I don't know what he ate," she said, before Hamish even sat down. "He eats everything, then he complains, then he writes about it." "Did he mention anything tasting odd?" Hamish asked. "Yes," she said. "He said one thing tasted bitter, not from the brandy, something else, something he couldn't place." Hamish felt a cold pinch in his stomach. Blair would enjoy that far too much. "Was it definitely the mince pie?" he asked. She looked irritated. "He didn't specify. He said village pie. That was all." Village pie, as if Loch Dhu were a single oven. Still, the word bitter clung like a burr. On his way out, Hamish ran into the hotel concierge, who whispered, "We'd be grateful if the police kept the matter quiet. We have bookings relying on good press." "Aye," Hamish said. "Everyone wants it quiet until it gets loud." He stepped outside. The cold slapped him again. The loch mist clung low, dull and heavy. Lugs lifted his head and whined. "Don't start," Hamish said. "We're knee-deep in trouble already." Back in Loch Dhu, Blair was waiting by the station door, breath clouding. "Well, did she admit he ate the pie?" "No," Hamish said. "She said he ate something bitter." Blair's grin spread slowly. "Bitter, is it? A good hint of poison, then. This village is under scrutiny, and if you muck it up, Macbeth, you'll be out." The words echoed longer than they should have. Hamish walked into the dim warmth of the station. The morning's burned bacon still sat on the plate, curled and stiff. He pushed it aside. Lugs settled at his feet, but the dog's tail lay flat, uneasy. Hamish stared at the cold hearth. The quiet felt heavy, not peaceful. Only one thought came to him, short and dry as usual. A missing pie had become a scandal, and Loch Dhu would bleed for it before anyone learned the truth. Freezing rain hammered the windscreen so hard the wipers gave up and shuddered across it in streaks. Hamish Macbeth hunched over the wheel, peering out as Tommel Castle Hotel loomed through the murk like a sulky beast. Something was already wrong. Blair would start shouting soon. He always did when he smelled scandal. And Hamish wanted a quiet look before the man arrived to trample everything flat. Lugg sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring ahead as if bracing for trouble. The dog was right to worry. The castle drive was slick with ice, and Hamish nearly slid into a stone planter before easing to a stop. He left Lugs in the Land Rover with a quick pat that did nothing to settle either of them. Inside, the entrance hall was warm but tense, the kind of warmth that made you aware of the cold still clinging to your clothes. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stood near the reception desk, tall and neat in a tweed skirt and pale jumper. She looked like she had never slipped on ice in her life. "I heard your car," she said without smiling. "My parents told me the police were sniffing around already." Hamish pushed wet hair off his forehead. "It's not as bad as that." "Isn't it?" She folded her arms and regarded him. "A visiting critic collapses in our dining room, mentioned something about a mince pie from Loch Dhu, and now Blair is salivating. Christmas bookings are already shaky. He'll ruin us if this becomes a story." "He'll ruin the village too," Hamish said. He had meant it to sound light, but it hung between them like damp laundry. Priscilla lifted an eyebrow. "The village can manage. The hotel cannot. Now what exactly happened?" Hamish felt his ears warm. Explaining things to Priscilla always felt like confessing wrongdoing. Morag MacLean brought a fancy mince pie to the fete. Someone stole it. Then that critic, Craig, ate something that tasted strange. He's in hospital now. Daviot seems to think the two are connected. "Do you?" Her tone was polite but chilly. "I don't know yet." Hamish shifted. His damp jacket squeaked. "I came to get a quiet look around before Blair starts shouting." "He doesn't shout," Priscilla said. "He bellows." She sighed, the only sign of strain. "If Blair thinks the hotel served something dangerous, he'll make a meal of it. You must not add to it, Hamish." He felt that small twist in his stomach, the one he always felt around her, half irritation, half something he never wanted to inspect. "I'm police. I need the staff rota and the guest list. Best to see who handled what." Her expression tightened. "Not unless you make a formal request through Strathbane." "That'll take days." "Well," she said, "I can't have the hotel's name thrown about because you think you can wander in and question staff whenever it amuses Blair. It's not for Blair, it's for the truth. Priscilla's eyes softened for half a second, then cooled again. You must go through Strathbane, I'm sorry. It was not an apology. It was a door shut quietly in his face. Hamish felt his shoulders slump. He wanted to argue, but her posture made it clear no argument would change anything. He nodded, awkward and defeated. The kitchen was a blur of steam and anxiety. The chef, a thick man with tired eyes, marched toward Hamish with a cleaver in hand, not raised, but enough to make Hamish edge back. I've heard the gossip, the chef said. Let me tell you plain. No mince pie from that Kirk Hall came through my pass. Not a crumb, not a sniff. If someone smuggled something in, it was not on my watch. Hamish took in the spotless counters and tense shoulders. No one's accusing you. You don't need to, Blair will. I've worked too hard to have my kitchen ruined by village bakers. It Wisney Morag's baking itself. I don't care whose baking it was, the chef snapped. None of it entered this kitchen. That's the truth. It sounded like the truth, though Hamish had learned long ago that the truth often arrived wearing a disguise. A junior waiter hovered near the pantry door, avoiding eye contact. Hamish recognized the look. Someone desperate not to be spoken to. He stepped over anyway. You serving last night? The lad swallowed. Aye, busy night. Did you see the critic? He nodded quickly. Yes, he was loud. Hamish waited. He had a slice of something, the boy muttered. Said he'd brought it himself. Hamish blinked. What kind of something? A mince pie slice. The waiter's eyes flicked toward the main kitchen, as if afraid the chef might burst through the wall. I thought it was daft, bringing your own food to a hotel like this, but he said it was from the fete, looked proud of it. Hamish exhaled. Why didn't you say that when the others were around? The boy flushed. The chef told us not to speak unless spoken to, and you didn't ask. It was a feeble excuse, but a familiar one. Lochdu and its surroundings were full of people who kept their mouths shut until the wrong moment. Don't repeat this, Hamish said. Not unless Blair corners you. Even then, think twice. The lad looked terrified at the thought of Blair. Aye, constable. Hamish walked out through the service hall, head buzzing with the boy's words. Craig had eaten a stolen pie slice. But from where? And why say he brought it himself? Folk lied for strange reasons, but usually not when drunk and trying to impress hotel guests. Outside, the rain had turned to needles. Lugs whined when Hamish climbed back into the Land Rover, shaking icy water off his coat. The dog pressed close, tail low. Aye, I know, Hamish said. It's all going sideways. He drove slowly down the winding road. Each corner felt like a trap. His thoughts were short, sharp, confused. Priscilla's refusal sat heavily on him. He had asked for a rota and a list, nothing more. She had treated him as if he had come to spoil her family's season. Maybe he had. Maybe everything he touched this week would fall apart. Lugs nudged his elbow, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Hamish gave the dog's ear a rough pat. We'll keep it quiet, he muttered. She wants it quiet. Blair wants it loud. I'll have to walk between them. But he knew, deep down, he was leaning the wrong direction. He wanted to spare the hotel embarrassment. He wanted to keep Blair from roaring through the place with his heavy boots and heavier accusations. He wanted, if he was honest, not to upset Priscilla further. It was a poor reason to make a decision, but he made it anyway. He would not push for the records today. He would wait. He told himself Blair could be calmed. He told himself this was sensible. The rain hit harder, a cold that soaked through everything. Lugs curled at his feet, uneasy. Tomorrow, Hamish said. I'll sort it tomorrow. But even as he said it, he knew tomorrow would belong to Blair, not to him. And the evidence he should have demanded would not wait politely. He drove on, the loch lost behind sheets of rain, the road ahead shining like black slate. Something felt wrong, and not just the weather. He had made his first mistake, and he knew it. But it was too late to undo. Blair arrived before Hamish had even finished his tea, which was already wrong. Blair never came early unless he meant trouble. The knock shook the station door hard enough to rattle the coat hooks. Lugs growled, low and uneasy, and Hamish felt the same. He opened the door to find Blair standing there with ice on his shoulders and satisfaction on his face. Anderson hovered behind him, damp and shivering, clutching a clipboard like a child clutching a schoolbook he hadn't read. Well, Macbeth, Blair said, marching inside without waiting to be asked, your critic friend didn't die. Not yet, anyway. but he's serious enough for the papers to sniff about. You'll be famous, in a pathetic sort of way." Hamish shut the door and tried not to sigh. "Glad he's alive," he said. "Folk get sick from overeating, or drinking." Blair slapped a piece of paper onto the desk. "Preliminary lab report. No poison." He tapped the page. "High alcohol. And something irritant." "An irritant could mean—" "Nothing useful," Blair interrupted. "Don't get clever. I'm starting with the usual suspects. The greedy and the needy. The ones who'd steal a pie and poison a man if they thought it'd earn them a pound or a moment of fame." Hamish felt his jaw tighten. "There's no sign anyone meant harm." "There's no sign they didn't," Blair said. His eyes gleamed. "I'll start with the lass who helped at the fete. Morag's niece, Isla McLean. Short of money, isn't she?" Hamish hesitated. Isla was short of money. Most in Lochdu were. That didn't make them thieves. But Blair enjoyed the scent of weakness. Hamish tried to keep his voice steady. "You've nothing on her." "Yet," Blair said, "but I will." Anderson scribbled dutifully, looking pleased to record misery. Hamish reached for his coat. "I'll speak to Morag and Isla myself." Blair smirked. "Aye, you do that. Maybe you'll get her to confess with your soft voice and soft head." Hamish opened the door pointedly. Blair and Anderson swaggered out as if they owned the village. Hamish locked the station behind him and whistled for Lugs, who bounded forward. Sonsie appeared from nowhere, tail flicking, as if she had been waiting to cause trouble. Hamish groaned. "Not you as well. Come on, then." The sleet was sharp enough to sting. The road to Morag's Croft was a long smear of mud and ice. Hamish drove slowly, wipers squeaking across half-frozen glass. Lugs shifted anxiously in the passenger seat. Sonsie kept leaping up at the back window, making her opinion of travel known. Morag opened her door before Hamish had even knocked. Her red-rimmed eyes told him Blair had been there first in spirit, if not in person. "I'll tell you right now," she said. "Isla never stole a thing in her life. If Blair says otherwise, he's a liar." Hamish stepped inside. The croft was warm enough, though the peat fire smoked badly. Sonsie darted past him and hopped onto a chair as if she owned it. Morag scowled at the cat, then turned her scowl on Hamish for allowing such a creature indoors. "Where's Isla?" Hamish asked. "In the back," Morag's voice cracked. "She's that upset." Isla came through the curtain, pale as flour. She wore a thick jumper several winters past its best. She twisted her hands together as nervous as a girl heading to headmistress's office. "Is it true?" she asked. "Sergeant Blair thinks I stole a pie and poisoned that man?" "No one said poisoned," Hamish replied. "Blair just—" "He thinks it," Isla whispered. "Everyone will think it." Hamish shook his head. "Just tell me where you were toward the end of the fete." "I was carrying plates in and out," Isla said. "Then Mr. Patel asked if I could help his nephew with the deliveries. He was behind, and I needed the money. I left early. I never touched the mince pie." Morag placed a protective arm around her niece, glaring at Hamish as if he were Blair himself. "You know Isla wouldn't steal. You know she's honest." "Aye," Hamish said, though he felt a faint tug at the back of his mind. The image of Isla near the side door of the Kirk Hall, looking distracted. But memory was a tricky beast. Folk drifted all over that hall. It meant nothing. He pushed it aside. Sonsie chose that moment to leap onto the dresser. A stack of tins rattled dangerously. "Sonsie, get down," Hamish ordered. The cat ignored him, of course, and batted at a small pie tin. It toppled to the floor with a metallic clatter, sending a puff of flour into the air. Morag snapped. "Get that creature down, Hamish. Can't you control a single animal in your life?" Hamish scooped Sonsie off the dresser. The cat struggled, shedding indignation everywhere. He picked up the fallen pie tin. There was a faint smear of rich filling clinging to the inside. Morag snatched it from him. "We bake," she said sharply. "That's what a kitchen is for. Don't you dare think it means anything." Hamish raised his hands. "I wasn't thinking anything." He was thinking something, but not about guilt. Only that Morag's temper could outmatch Blair's on a good day, and that he wanted to get out of the croft before someone hit him. Back in Lochdu, the sleet had thickened into icy pellets. Blair stood outside Patel's shop, barking orders at Anderson as though conducting an army. Hamish stepped forward before Blair could storm inside. "Leave Isla out of it," he said. "I've spoken to her. The girl was nowhere near the pie when it vanished." Blair's eyes narrowed. "Is that right?" "Aye," Hamish continued. "If you're looking for someone who slipped away, check Patel's delivery book. Someone could have used the van to run something off." It was out of his mouth before he realized what he'd done. Blair's face lit with mean pleasure. Patel's nephew? Ravi? Aye, the lad who drives about as if the roads belong to him. I didn't say. You did, Blair cut in, and I'll be checking that book. Finally, Macbeth, something useful out of you. Anderson scribbled madly. Hamish felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had meant to divert suspicion away from Isla, but instead he had pointed Blair toward Ravi, a lad who already carried the burden of being not from here in a village that remembered every outsider's mistake. Patel himself stepped out of the shop then, holding a bag of flour. He looked from Blair to Hamish and back again. Is there trouble? He asked carefully. Just routine, Blair said loudly. We're following a lead. Your nephew may be able to help us. Patel's polite smile thinned. My nephew is innocent. Blair leaned closer, voice oily. We'll see. Hamish opened his mouth, but nothing useful came out. The villagers across the street were watching. A crofter whispered to a fisher. Someone nudged someone else. Gossip was already swelling, the way it always did. Wrong first, right last, and never without spite. Blair turned on his heel. Come on, Anderson. We'll start with the shop, you. He jabbed a finger at Hamish. Stay out of my way unless you grow a backbone. They marched off, leaving Hamish standing in sleet that stung his face harder than before. Lugs pressed against his leg, shivering in the cold tension. Sonsie wound around his boot in a smug figure eight, oblivious to the damage Hamish had just caused. Aye, Hamish muttered. I know. I made a mess of it. He watched Blair disappear into Patel's shop, the villagers turning to stare at Hamish as if he had opened the door for the sergeant himself. He had backed the wrong lass. Worse, he had handed Blair a new target, one who would not be forgiven easily, and the real culprit, whoever they were, had just been granted more time to hide. Wet snow slapped against the station windows in thick, miserable clumps. Something was already wrong. Lugs paced near the stove, restless, sensing trouble before it arrived. Hamish had barely managed a swallow of lukewarm tea when he heard shouting outside. Blair's voice, carrying over the wind like a cattle prod. It was the busiest time of day for Patel's shop. Of course Blair would choose it. Of course he would. Hamish tugged on his coat and stepped out into the slush. Villagers were already gathered in a loose ring outside the shop door, some pretending to browse the notice board, others craning their necks openly. No one liked a scandal, but everyone liked watching one. Inside, the heat from the little wall heater fought with the damp smell of wet wool. The queue wound past shelves of bread, tins of soup, and jars of dull-coloured sweets. Blair stood near the counter, broad and steaming with fury, Anderson beside him with his pen poised like a weapon he didn't know how to use. "I'll need a word with your nephew, Mr. Patel," Blair boomed, "about stolen food and poisoned pies." The shop fell silent. Mrs. McGregor dropped a packet of tea, and it hit the floor with a thud that sounded far too loud for such a small thing. Mr. Patel, neat in his sweater and apron, blinked slowly, then set down the jar he had been shelving. "My nephew is in the back," he said, "but he is busy." "He'll be busier in a moment," Blair growled. "Fetch him." Ravi appeared in the doorway, hands dusty from stacking boxes. He froze when he saw the sergeant. Hamish felt the boy's fear from across the room. People in Lochdu had long memories, and Ravi had only been here a few years. It hardly mattered that he worked hard or minded his manners. He was still new, and in Blair's eyes that was suspicion enough. "You!" Blair barked. "Did you use that van to shift a fancy pie to someone who would pay for it?" Ravi's mouth fell open. "What? No, sir. I didn't go near the Kirk Hall." "And yet," Blair said, leaning across the counter like a heavy storm cloud, "you were making deliveries, alone, with access to the roads, the back lanes, and wherever else you pleased." Mr. Patel bristled. "My nephew would not steal from a church hall. Not from anyone." "A church hall?" Blair let out a cruel laugh. "A likely target for folk wanting to make a quick pound. Don't play innocent." Villagers shifted uneasily. Someone muttered, "Aye, I heard the van was late that day." Another said, "Didn't he take the Loch Road? Strange route for deliveries." Ravi flinched at each whisper. Hamish pushed forward. "You're going the wrong way about this, Blair." Blair turned, eyes gleaming. "Oh, look who's arrived. Macbeth, the saviour of the guilty. Did you hold the boy's hand on the way here?" Hamish ignored him. He stepped to the counter, noticing a delivery book lying open. Pages filled with neat columns of handwriting, dates, times, drop-offs, except one. Between two charity entries the numbers jumped. A missing line. Someone had written something there, then torn it out. A small clue. But he didn't reach for it fast enough. Blair slammed the book shut with a sharp crack. "This," he announced, "is now evidence. I'll be taking it to Strathbane." Mr. Patel stiffened. "That book is for my business. You cannot simply—" "I can," Blair snapped. "And I have." Ravi swayed forward, panic breaking through his shock. "I never went near the Kirk. I took the van round the Lock Road that night. The long way. It was icy. I didn't want to risk—" "Long way?" Blair pounced. "Why take the long way unless you had something to hide?" Ravi's face drained of all colour. I wasn't—" "Another lie," Blair said, looking pleased. "One more and I'll have you in cuffs." People whispered again. Some turned their backs as if to shield themselves from the sight. Others stared openly, glad not to be the ones on display. The row had built its own weather, hot, mean and loud, and Loch Dhu was lapping it up. Hamish felt the weight of it, all of it, his mistake at Morag's, his foolishness in turning Blair's attention toward the van, Ravi's wide, frightened eyes, Patel's stiff humiliation, and the villagers, clutching their shopping bags, pretending not to watch while watching everything. Blair jerked his chin at Anderson. "Bag the book, we're off." Anderson fumbled with a plastic evidence bag, dropped it, picked it up, and finally managed to slide the delivery book inside. He glanced nervously at Hamish, then quickly looked away. Blair strode out, pushing past Hamish with his shoulder. "Next time, Macbeth, try helping instead of hindering, unless you enjoy seeing innocent folk suffer." The words burned, mostly because they were true. Hamish followed slowly. Outside, the villagers parted like a thawing puddle, careful not to meet his eye. A fisherman gave a sheepish nod, then pretended a sudden interest in the state of the gutter. Mrs. McGregor busied herself wiping the tea packet as though it might tell her more clues if she polished it enough. Lugs whined softly at Hamish's heel, sensing his tension but not knowing what to do with it. Sonsie padded out from under a bench and stared up at him with that smug, unreadable face cats were born knowing how to make. Hamish almost envied her simplicity. He stood there in the wet snow, looking at Patel's shop door closing slowly behind them. Inside sat a ruined Morning, a frightened boy, and a proud man brought low, and all because Hamish had tried, clumsily, blindly, to shield one lass and ended up exposing someone else entirely. The snow fell harder, cold and mean. Hamish shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. He had handed Blair a new victim. Loch Dhu would not forget that in a hurry, and the real culprit was still out there, hidden behind gossip and slush. The manse hallway smelled of damp wool and boiled vegetables, which was already wrong. Hamish Macbeth had never known a Kirk session meeting to smell of anything other than old hymn books and grudges. Lugs pressed close to his leg, ears twitching at the muffled voices drifting from the sitting room. Outside, icy fog rolled along the loch and wrapped round the house like an unwelcome visitor. The whole evening felt tight and unfriendly. Mrs. Campbell opened the door before Hamish could knock. She wore an apron over her blouse, as if she had been wrestling with pots rather than scandal. "Constable Macbeth," she said, with the stiff politeness she reserved for doctors and undertakers. "Do come in. The elders are waiting for you." Hamish stepped inside. Lugs crept after him, tail low. The sitting room was crammed with elders in Sunday suits, though it was a weekday and none of them looked holy. They shuffled on the chairs, clearing throats, whispering behind hands. A tray of dry biscuits sat untouched. No one wanted to be seen eating at a time like this. "Thank you for coming," the minister said, though he did not look thankful. "We understand you're here to reassure us." "Aye," Hamish said, settling onto a hard chair that felt designed to punish thought. "I'll do my best." The elders eyed him as if that were the problem. Mrs. Campbell stood near the fireplace, wringing her hands over a tea towel. "Some of our donors want their money back," she said sharply. "They claim the fate was nothing but a front for some wickedness. Imagine that, after all my work." Hamish murmured something neutral. The room did not soften. One of the elders produced an envelope from his coat pocket. "This arrived at the manse this afternoon," he said. "Push through the letterbox. No stamp." He handed it to Hamish. Inside was a folded sheet of cheap-lined paper. The message was written in block capitals that slanted unevenly. "Sweet revenge is served in small slices. You were warned." Hamish read it twice. The ink had smudged in places, likely from damp fingers. He folded it neatly and slipped it into his pocket. "Anyone recognise the writing?" he asked. "Of course not," Mrs. Campbell snapped. "Wicked people don't sign their names." "It mightn't be wicked," one elder said. "It might just be about the critic." "Or the pie," muttered another. "Or some spite from years ago," said a third, nodding wisely as if spite required no explanation. Arguments broke out at once. The minister tried to hush them, but no one listened. Hamish watched, saying little, listening more. Lochdu arguments always carried tiny truths hidden inside the noise. Tonight, though, all he heard was fear and pride grinding against each other. When the quarrel dipped enough for him to speak, he asked, "Did anyone here have trouble with Alistair Craig before?" The responses came quickly. "Never met the man. He probably hates churches. I heard he ruined a hotel in Perth. My cousin's neighbour knew someone who worked for him and said he was a devil to please." None of it useful, all of it loud. Hamish leaned back. His thoughts were short and plain. Folk liked shouting about what they didn't understand, made them feel clever, even when they weren't. An elder with bristly eyebrows pointed a finger at Hamish. "This is your fault. If Macbeth had kept order at the Fete, none of this would have happened." Another elder nodded, looking relieved someone else had said it first. The rest didn't contradict him. They stared at Hamish with the disappointed faces of people who had already chosen a culprit. Hamish sat very still. Lugs shifted uneasily, pawing at his boot. Hamish didn't look down. His face stayed blank, but inside he felt the small, tired weight that came from being blamed for other people's nonsense. The minister cleared his throat loudly. "Let's not lay blame without cause." "Oh, cause," the bristly elder repeated. "There's cause enough. Newspapers are sniffing round. The critic's wife is still at Tommel Castle, and now we have threatening letters." Mrs. Campbell nodded, lips pursed. "If the village is dragged through the mud, the kirk will be dragged with it." The meeting dissolved into mutters again, this time lower, darker. Hamish let the noise wash over him. He had learned long ago that arguing only made folk louder. Outside, through the fogged window, he could see the outline of two neighbours standing on the pavement, talking in low voices. They were likely already telling others the kirk money was tainted, the Fete was cursed, and that Lochdu had become the sort of place where pies turned poisonous and critics dropped like flies. At last the minister dismissed the meeting with a weary sigh. No one seemed comforted by anything said. Mrs. Campbell opened the door for Hamish, stiff as a lamppost. "I trust you'll sort this quickly," she said. "The manse doesn't deserve this kind of attention." "No one does," Hamish replied. It was the closest he could manage to reassurance. Outside, the icy fog pressed close again. Lugs walked beside him, shoulders hunched. A few villagers passed by, nodding politely, but their eyes slid away. A crofter muttered, "Shameful," as if talking to himself. A tourist couple whispered as Hamish passed, pretending to admire the frost on the wall. By the time he reached the station, the fog had thickened into a cold that stuck to his coat. The phone was ringing as he opened the door. He answered it with a sense of dread that turned out to be justified. "Macbeth," Davitt snapped down the line, not bothering with a greeting. "Why am I hearing that your village is hinted at in a Glasgow paper? Something about a minister's fate gone wrong and a poisoned guest." Hamish closed his eyes briefly. "It's exaggeration, sir." "It's embarrassment," Davitt corrected. "Utter embarrassment. Get this tidied, Macbeth, or you'll find yourself transferred somewhere far less cosy, where you can't coddle your precious villagers." Hamish let him finish his rant, murmured the expected replies, and hung up. The peat fire sputtered faintly, as unwilling as he was to brighten the room. Lugs lay down with a sigh, head on his paws. Hamish rubbed the dog's ear absently. His mind flicked back to the anonymous letter, the torn-out line in Patel's book, Ravi's pale face, Isla's twisting hands, Morag's fury, Priscilla's cool refusal, Blair's stomping triumph, a mess of crumbs, all pointing nowhere useful. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a cold warning. Lochdu's name was being dragged through mud, and his job, such as it was, hung by a thread thin enough to snap at the next wrong word. Snow muffled Lochdu so thoroughly that Hamish Macbeth woke with the uneasy sense that the world had been smothered overnight. Something was already wrong. The silence felt too heavy, too expectant. Lugs paced the station floor in quick little steps, ears twitching at sounds Hamish couldn't hear. Then came the knock. 3 hard blows that made the mugs on the shelf rattle. Blair didn't wait to be invited in. He shoved the door open and entered with the smug certainty of a man rehearsing his own glory. Anderson scurried behind him, along with a forensic officer who looked half frozen and entirely confused as to why he was in a Highland village at dawn. "Up, Macbeth," Blair announced, though Hamish was already standing. "We've got her." "Got who?" Hamish asked, though a cold guess already sat in his stomach. "Morag MacLean," Blair grinned. "Your precious baker has been caught out." Hamish reached for his coat. "What are you talking about?" "You'll see." Blair strode out again, expecting the world to follow him like a parade. The snow was thick enough to swallow footsteps within minutes. As they trudged toward Morag's cottage, the cold bit into Hamish's ears. Lugs trotted ahead, stopping every few feet to look back, tail stiff. Even the dog seemed to know Blair's mood meant trouble. At Morag's door, Blair didn't bother knocking softly. He hammered until the door flew open and Morag appeared, wrapped in a cardigan and outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. Blair raised a foil pie dish between 2 gloved fingers, holding it as triumphantly as if it were the crown jewels. "We found this in your outside bin." Morag stared at the dish as if it was something dead. "Anyone could have put that there." "And yet," Blair said loudly, "it's covered in traces of the same rich mincemeat as your so-called famous pie. And something else. Something bitter." He looked around, making sure the neighbours peeking from their doorways heard that part. Hamish glanced at the bin. Snow lay in a smooth layer on the lid, undisturbed. He lifted his eyes to Blair. "If you found that this morning, how did you open the bin without disturbing the snow?" Blair ignored him. "Forensic says there's a nasty irritant mixed with the fruit, strong enough to fell a grown man." "That's not what the report said yesterday," Hamish murmured. "It said irritant, not poison." Blair rolled his eyes. "Macbeth, must you cling to every technicality to save your friends? She stole the pie. She dosed it. She humiliated a respected guest. End of story." Morag's face went white. "I would never hurt anyone. You know that," she said, turning to Hamish. Her voice wasn't pleading, just stunned. Hamish opened his mouth, but words failed him. His earlier mistakes, defending Isla too quickly, pointing Blair toward Ravi, had stripped him of whatever authority he might have had left. His voice felt thin, useless. Blair snapped, "Anderson, do your job." Anderson stepped forward, looking miserable, but he cuffed Morag all the same. The metal clinked too loudly in the snowy morning. Several neighbours gasped. One whispered, "I always thought she was strange." Another muttered, "Poisoner, imagine that." Morag lifted her chin. "Shame on the lot of you," she said, but her eyes flicked once more to Hamish, searching for something he didn't have. As they led her away, the forensic officer hovered by the bin. Hamish walked to him, leaned down, and wiped a finger across the untouched snow. "No footprints here," he said quietly. The man shrugged. "Sergeant said it didn't matter." Of course Blair had said that. Back at the station, Blair strutted about like a rooster, shaking flakes of snow off his coat. "Told Daviot the case is well in hand," he announced. "He's delighted we've wrapped it quickly." Hamish sat at his desk with the forensic note Blair had tossed to him. He read it twice. The irritant was closer to a strong laxative than any poison. Enough to make a man ill, certainly, but not kill him. It pointed toward humiliation, not murder. "It doesn't match your claim," Hamish said. "This wasn't attempted poisoning." Blair made a dismissive noise. "Lawyers talk. The press won't care what it was. They'll lap up jealous local baker turns on critic. Anderson, draft a press note, emphasize competition among villagers, makes them colourful." Anderson scribbled, nodding at every word like a clockwork puppet. Hamish fought the urge to throw the paperweight at Blair's head. "You're ruining her life over nothing proven." "Nothing proven?" Blair barked a laugh. "Everything points to her, and I don't need you undermining the case again." Again. The word bit hard. Blair wasn't wrong. Hamish had been stumbling from mistake to mistake, trying to spare folk who didn't want sparing and ignoring the ones who needed it. Blair clapped his hands once. "I'm off to phone the press. Try not to lose anything while I'm gone." He left the station door wide open, letting a gust of icy air sweep in. Lugs growled, deep and low, staring at the doorway. When Blair's footsteps faded, the dog padded over to Hamish's desk, sniffed the anonymous letter, the one with blocky capitals promising revenge in small slices. His ears pricked in that uneasy way that meant he sensed tension, not truth. Hamish rubbed Lugs's head, though his own mind felt as foggy as the loch. "Aye," he muttered, "everything's going the wrong way." Morag in custody, Blair triumphant, Daviot pleased, villagers whispering, and Hamish standing almost alone, with only scraps of doubt to work with. He folded the letter again, the ink smudged under his thumb. Somewhere in Loch Dhu the real culprit was still laughing. The rain hit the police Land Rover sideways, blown in fierce sheets off the loch. Something was already wrong. A day earlier, folk had only whispered about Tommel Castle Hotel. Now they spoke of it as if it carried plague. Hamish Macbeth drove up the long gravel sweep, the wind pushing against the bonnet like a hand trying to shove him back down the hill. Lugs whimpered at each thunderous blast of rain against the windows, then pressed himself to the seat, unsure and unhappy. Inside the entrance hall the air was warmer but tight, stretched over too much worry. A pair of tourists hurried past Hamish toward the exit, not meeting his eye. A man at reception muttered about cancellation fees. The young clerk nodded with the trapped smile of someone who had already heard worse that morning. Hamish made for the kitchen. The chef stood at a counter, wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. His face was red and slick with sweat, though the kitchen wasn't hot. Before Hamish even spoke, the chef snapped, "If you're here to ask again, save your breath." Hamish kept his voice even. "Just want clarity." "Clarity," the chef repeated, then snorted. "I'm not saying another word without a solicitor. I'm not taking the blame for some village carry-on. If folk up there can't keep their ingredients clean, that's not on me." Hamish felt a flicker of temper. "No one's blaming. You are," the chef said sharply, "by asking, so I'm done talking." It was a firm refusal, and the man enjoyed giving it. Before Hamish could push back, Priscilla entered through the service door. She carried no umbrella, yet her hair and jumper were immaculate, as if rain knew better than to touch her. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were tight at the edges. "Hamish," she said, "my parents are beside themselves. One tour party has already cancelled outright. Staff are talking about hours being cut. Can you not simply accept that Morag did something foolish?" Hamish stiffened. "I don't believe Morag did this." Priscilla's tone cooled further. "You may not believe it, but the rest of the Highlands will if you keep digging in the wrong places." There was a silence, the kind that made Hamish aware of how tall and gawky he must look beside her. He wanted to argue, properly argue, but instead he muttered, "Did Craig complain directly to the kitchen before he collapsed?" Priscilla shook her head. "Only to the waiter, and that man drank enough whiskey afterwards to flatten a horse. Hardly evidence of anything." The chef grinned at that, vindicated. Hamish drifted a step away, letting his eyes roam the kitchen shelves. Jars of mincemeat were lined up neatly, bottles of brandy beside them, all ordinary enough. But behind a sack of flour tucked awkwardly out of sight, he saw a near-empty bottle of strong herbal tonic. He recognised the label. It was the sort of thing old crofters used for digestive complaints and for killing slugs in the garden. The chef noticed where Hamish was looking. "That's for my back pain," he said too quickly. "Old rugby injury." "Aye," Hamish replied, voice flat. It was a tempting red herring, almost too tempting. Without thinking, he shifted slightly so Lugs, who had padded in after him, couldn't get too close to the shelves. The dog sniffed the air, uneasy, but that was nothing new. A maid passed through with a tray and paused when she saw Hamish. "Constable," she whispered, glancing toward the corridor. "I heard talk from my cousin in Oban. That critic, Craig, he ruined a hotel there last year. Wrote a column about filthy carpets and worse management. Folk say someone sent him a present after it, a spoiled haggis or something. Just saying." "Who sent it?" Hamish asked. The maid shrugged, pleased to have offered something spicy. "No idea. Folk love stories more than facts." Priscilla stepped between them. "Staff shouldn't be passing rumours to police. Get back to your duties." The maid scurried off, cheeks pink. Hamish waited a beat. "You think someone held a grudge?" he asked quietly. "I think," Priscilla replied, "that your presence is upsetting everyone far more than any grudge." It was not a cruel remark, but it landed like one. Hamish felt himself pull back, as if retreating into old habits. He nodded stiffly and thanked her for the information he hadn't truly received. When he stepped back out into the main hall, another guest was at reception, arguing about a refund. The clerk glanced over with a look that was part apology, part resentment. Hamish felt the familiar prickle between his shoulder blades, that mix of blame and expectation that Lochdu sometimes placed on him, even though he wasn't the one dragging their names through the papers. The rain was worse when he left the castle. Needles of water drove into the windscreen, rhythm frantic. The headlights caught the spray and turned it into a wall of silver. Hamish blinked against the strain. "Folk are losing their heads," he muttered to Luggs, "and I'm letting them." He should have pressed the chef harder. He should have demanded access to the hotel rota despite Priscilla's cold reluctance. He shouldn't have let her tone steer him sideways yet again. But the moment had passed, and now any demand would look like an attack on the hotel, a hotel already trembling under cancelled bookings. Halfway down the hill, the wind shoved the Land Rover toward the verge. Hamish corrected, jaw tight, eyes sore from the gloom. There were too many threads and not enough truth. Someone in Lochdu or somewhere near it had played a dangerous trick, but the suspects scattered like minnows as soon as he reached for them. By the time he reached the station, night had settled thickly. The fire had gone out. Luggs shook water from his coat, spraying damp across the floor. Hamish stood a moment in the dimness, letting the silence settle. No answers, no progress. Only more people annoyed with him, more gossip spreading, more damage tightening its grip on the village. Priscilla wanted him to protect the hotel. Blair wanted him to ruin the village. And Hamish had spent the day disappointing both sides. He hung up his coat, the water pooling beneath it. "Tomorrow," he muttered. "I'll push harder tomorrow." But the uneasy feeling settled deeper. He had slipped again, even if no one but the walls of the station knew it. Someone out there had more time now. Time to hide, to destroy, to twist the story further. Time he had foolishly given them. Sonsie was already doing something she shouldn't. That was the first wrong thing about the morning. Hamish Macbeth stepped into his kitchen to find the cat squatting on the table, tail twitching, batting a greasy paper bag back and forth like a trophy. Luggs hovered below, whining in complaint or warning. It was hard to tell which. "Off the table," Hamish muttered, but Sonsie gave him a bold stare and continued swiping at the bag. When he lifted it from under her paw, she let out a small yowl of outrage, as if he was stealing something from her instead of the other way round. The bag was damp and smelled faintly of peat and wet wood. Inside lay a dented, silver-coloured pie tin. There was a smear of that rich mincemeat, the same sort that had caused half the village to lose its mind, and a scrap of lace doily stuck near the rim. Hamish frowned. He knew that doily pattern. Mrs. Campbell had chosen it herself for the display table at the fete. "Well, where did you get this?" he asked Sonsie. She chirped in answer and hopped off the table, brushing against his legs before trotting toward the door. Luggs whined again, more insistently this time. Hamish grabbed his coat. "All right," he said. "Show me." Sonsie led him out of the station and along the lane with a smug, prancing step, tail high as a standard. Hamish trudged after her through the muddy verge, wondering bleakly if he had sunk so far that he was now taking investigative leads from a cat. The snow had melted into a fine drizzle, turning everything dull and slick. His boots sucked at the wet ground. Sonsie darted toward the school. Behind the building, a narrow path wound uphill to an old tool shed half sunk into the slope, a place where forgotten things went to rot in peace. The cat stopped at the door and pawed it, then looked back at Hamish as if to say he was slow. Inside, the shed was dim, smelling of mildew and hymn sheets. Stacked chairs leaned at odd angles. A broken mop handle lay like a bone across the floor. Hamish crouched. Crumbs, small, scattered crumbs, speckled the boards. Not fresh, but not ancient either. A folded tartan scarf sat on a chair. He picked it up, slightly damp, mud at the edges. Someone had been here recently. Footsteps crunched outside. The school janitor poked his head in. "Constable, can I help you?" Hamish held up the scarf. "Yours?" The man shook his head too quickly. "Not been in here since summer. Told the minister I'd clear it out next year." Hamish's dry thought was that the man was lying, badly. "Anyone else keep a key?" "A few folk," the janitor said, looking anywhere but at Hamish. "Miss Fraser might. She stores extra books up here." Miss Fraser. The new schoolteacher who lectured villagers about the dangers of sugar as if she were defending civilization from collapse. Hamish rubbed the pie tin's dent with his thumb. It didn't feel right. But nothing else had either. By the time he followed Sonsie back down to the lane, word had already slipped through the village like wind through cracks. A neighbour intercepted him near Patel's shop. "I saw that Miss Fraser slipping round the back of the kirk during the fete," the woman whispered. "Thought nothing of it then. But now, well, everyone's talking." Hamish grimaced. "Best not spread tales till we know more." The woman pursed her lips. "Folk should know when there's danger." Inside the shop, the gossip was buzzing like a hornet nest. "She never liked that bake sale," someone said loudly. "Always telling bairns about chemicals in biscuits." Another muttered, "Maybe she thought she'd teach the village a lesson." By the afternoon, Blair had caught the scent of fresh blood. He stormed into the school with Anderson at his heels, puffed up like a turkey ready for the roasting pan. "Miss Fraser," Blair boomed in the corridor, "we need a word." The teacher emerged from her classroom, pale and severe, her hands clasped tightly. Behind her, children fell silent, listening in bold fascination. Blair paced in front of her. "We have reason to believe someone with moral notions sabotaged the mince pie to make a point. Someone who disapproved of sugar and fat and whatnot. Someone who might have slipped behind the kirk during the fete." Miss Fraser's eyes flashed. "You'll not bully me into confessing something I did not do." "No one mentioned confessing," Blair said loudly, glancing toward the classroom door where several little faces peered out. "But if the shoe fits—" Hamish stepped between them. "Blair, not here. Children don't need to hear this." Blair sneered. "They should learn early that crime has consequences." Miss Fraser drew herself up taller than she really was. "If you accuse me formally, Sergeant, I will require representation." "And guilt shows itself in big words," Blair said with a flourish. Anderson scribbled behind him, pleased to have something sharp to record. Hamish felt heat rise in his face. "No one is accusing anyone yet." "No one except Macbeth," Blair said, "and half the village." That part wasn't entirely untrue, which stung more than it should. Miss Fraser stared at Hamish. "Do you believe I did this?" Hamish opened his mouth, but nothing certain came. Sonsie's pie tin sat heavy in his coat pocket. The crumbs in the shed, the scarf, the janitor's lie. It made a shape, but not one he trusted. "I'm asking questions," he said finally. "That's all." Her face froze. "That is not an answer." Blair clapped his hands once, satisfied. "We'll be back. Don't leave the village." She turned her back on them, disappearing into the classroom like a door slamming shut without a sound. Outside, the drizzle had turned the lane into a brown ribbon of muck. Sonsie reappeared, rubbing against Hamish's ankle as if congratulating herself on a job well done. Lug stood a few feet away, uneasy, ears low. The dog sensed the crack running through the village, the tension pooling like damp in the walls. Hamish looked toward the kirk, then toward the school, then toward the hills beyond Lochdu. The village was eating itself with suspicion, faster each day, tearing holes in its own peace. And all he had was a cat's find, a muddy scarf, and the knowledge that yet another villager now stood under a cloud he couldn't lift. He brushed the drizzle from his brow. The investigation had moved forward, yes, but in a direction he didn't trust. The kirk hall felt colder than the frost outside, which was already wrong. Hamish Macbeth had lit the heaters an hour earlier, but they only managed to push the cold around instead of warming it. Lugs lay near the door, ears angled back, uneasy. Even Sonsie, perched on a stack of hymn books, watched the gathering with the sly calm of something that expected trouble. Hamish had invited them one by one, quietly, without telling Strathbane. He didn't need Blair swooping in to ruin things. Now they stood in a tense half-circle. Morag, pale but upright. Miss Fraser, rigid with indignation. Mr. Patel and Ravi, both stiff as fence posts. The chef from Tommel Castle, arms folded and full of resentment. And Mrs. Campbell, lips tight as a purse clasp. Priscilla stood near the wall, unreadable, offering no comfort and no interference. On the table were several mince pies, some neat, some lopsided. Hamish had coaxed each of them to bring their usual version, and baked one himself to copy Morag's recipe as best he could. The hall smelled of pastry and suspicion. Hamish cleared his throat. "Right, we're going to go over the fate again, step by step. No shouting if we can help it." Shouting began almost immediately. Morag jabbed a finger at Miss Fraser. "You were hovering near my table. I saw you." "I was rearranging the napkins," Miss Fraser snapped. "They were a disgrace. Someone had folded them into little boats." "That was my niece," Morag said hotly. "She has a creative mind." The chef muttered to no one in particular. If people left catering to professionals, none of this would have happened. Ravi flinched at his tone. Mr. Patel put a hand on his nephew's arm and murmured something in Gujarati that Hamish didn't understand, but recognised as a warning to stay quiet. Hamish let them swirl a moment. He'd learned that villagers, like hens, needed to flap before they settled. Priscilla watched with a faint tilt of her head, as though observing a performance she didn't particularly enjoy. "Let's keep going," Hamish said, from when the tables were arranged. Mrs. Campbell sniffed. "I helped with that. The display was uneven, so I moved a few items for balance." "Which items?" Hamish asked. "Just some." She waved a hand vaguely. "To the front." Morag stared at her. "You moved my pie." "I may have moved it," Mrs. Campbell admitted, briefly, to improve the look of the table. Miss Fraser folded her arms tighter. She was fussing over everything, could hardly breathe without her straightening something. Mr. Patel spoke at last, his voice gentle but firm. "My nephew was nowhere near the pies, Sergeant. This whole business has taken a toll on him." Ravi nodded quickly, eyes darting toward Blair's favourite shadow, even though Blair wasn't there. Yet. Hamish picked up a mince pie, one of the rougher ones. "This is mine. I baked it to match Morag's method." He set it down. "The point is not the pies themselves. It's who touched what and when." The chef rolled his eyes. "Inspector work with pastries now, is it?" "It gets results," Hamish said mildly. He reached into his pocket and drew out the anonymous letter. The block capitals glared up from the paper. "Sweet revenge is served in small slices. You were warned." "Anyone recognize the handwriting?" Hamish asked. A ripple went through the group. Miss Fraser shook her head sharply. Mr. Patel frowned. Ravi swallowed. The chef shrugged, already bored. Morag looked hurt that such a thing even existed. Only Mrs. Campbell stood very still, her hand tightening on her handbag until the clasp squeaked. Hamish watched her, expression unreadable. Funny phrase, sweet revenge. Sounds like someone with a sense of drama. No one spoke. The air in the hall thickened. Hamish placed the letter on the table beside the pies. "Before we go further, you should all know something I've kept quiet until now. The hospital doctor told me Craig wasn't poisoned. No deadly substance, just a strong laxative and far too much drink." Morag let out a sharp breath. Miss Fraser blinked, surprised. The chef muttered, "Idiot drank like a fish, no wonder." Hamish continued, voice flat. "So someone meant to shame him, not kill him." Mrs. Campbell's lips twitched. Not surprise, annoyance. Hamish felt the room shift around her. He reached into his coat again and unfolded an old newspaper clipping. Craig wrote this column 2 years ago about a church fundraiser in Ayr, called it a stale affair with stale cakes, ruined the attendance for the next season. He turned the clipping so the group could see. The woman who organised that fundraiser was Mrs. Campbell's sister. A long silence dropped over the hall. Even Sonsie paused her tail flick. Mrs. Campbell's chin lifted. "A coincidence," she said, but her voice was thin. Hamish set the tartan scarf from the tool shed beside the pies, found in the school shed, and crumbs there too. "And your husband told me the key to the school shed hangs in the manse kitchen. You had access, opportunity, and a reason." Her face whitened, then flushed red. "I hid the pie in the school shed for a while when things got busy and must have left my tartan scarf there in the rush. I never thought anyone would find it." Morag stared in disbelief. "You used my pie?" "I added only a little herbal tonic," Mrs. Campbell insisted, "meant for cleansing. I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. I moved your pie to the front and assumed he'd choose it. I never meant the whole village to be blamed. I never imagined that dreadful man Blair would arrest you." The chef let out a low whistle. "Church ladies," he said, "always the worst." Mr. Patel closed his eyes as if trying to steady himself. Ravi looked stricken. Miss Fraser seemed simultaneously relieved and offended that her name was no longer central. Priscilla remained unreadable, though Hamish sensed she was quietly relieved it wasn't tied to the hotel staff. The door banged open. Blair strode in, coat unbuttoned, cheeks gleaming with frost and fury. "Macbeth, I just heard. What's all this? You think you can run an investigation without me?" Mrs. Campbell gasped and clutched her handbag. Morag stepped instinctively behind Hamish as if he were a shield. Hamish didn't move. "We have the culprit, Blair." Blair glared at Mrs. Campbell. "Her? You're telling me this? This woman did it. His voice pitched up in frustration. You've ruined everything, Macbeth. I was building a strong case, a clear case. A wrong case, Hamish said simply. Blair sputtered, reddening. Anderson loomed behind him, notebook already open, confused as ever. Mrs. Campbell's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the dread of gossip that would never die. I never meant harm, she whispered. Only a lesson. Hamish sighed. The damage was already done. The village had been torn apart, and the truth would not stitch it together neatly. He looked around the hall. No one felt victorious. Not Morag, freed but shaken. Not Ravi, still bruised from suspicion. Not Miss Fraser, still stiff with wounded dignity. Not Priscilla, cool and distant. Not even the chef, who crossed his arms in defence against the awkwardness now hanging in the air. Only Blair looked ready to explode, and that was trouble for another day. Hamish let the silence drop again, cold and heavy. Lochdu would not recover quickly from this bitter slice of truth. He still didn't know who had actually lifted the pie from the table and carried it away, but that theft felt small beside the damage Mrs. Campbell's spite had done. A thin, mean frost clung to Lochdu the next morning, which was wrong for the season, and wrong for Hamish Macbeth's hopes that the scandal might begin to thaw. Trouble in a village never vanished neatly, no matter how clear the culprit. It simply settled into the ground like ice, waiting for someone to slip on it. Lugs paced near the station stove, restless again. Sonsie darted in and out of the doorway with the smug air of a creature who believed she had solved the whole affair herself. Hamish ignored both, staring at the telephone as if willing it not to ring. It rang anyway. Daviot's voice came sharp as vinegar. Macbeth, I suppose you're pleased with yourself. A circus? An utter circus, run without authority. Your stunt at the Kirk Hall is already in the papers. Hamish rubbed his brow. It was necessary. You don't decide what's necessary, Daviot snapped. Glasgow papers are calling it a vengeful village pie. Do you know how ridiculous that sounds? Aye, Hamish said. I do. There was a long hiss of displeasure on the line. If I could spare the manpower, Macbeth, you'd be transferred to a place where no one bakes anything. Consider this a warning. Another performance like that, and you won't be policing so much as a sheep. The line went dead. Hamish replaced the receiver gently, though his hand twitched with the urge to throw it. Outside the station, villagers walked past stiffly. Lochdu had not forgiven itself yet. Morag arrived first, not to thank him. Hamish had expected no such thing, but to look him square in the face. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her mouth was set in a hard line. You thought I could do such a thing, she said. He blinked. I never actually said. You thought it, she insisted. Otherwise Blair wouldn't have dared. Hamish opened his mouth, closed it again, and settled for a small nod that pleased no one. Morag left without another word, her boots crunching out an accusation he couldn't answer. Mid-morning, Patel's shop looked fuller than it had in days, but folk spoke quietly. Ravi stacked tins with careful precision, head lowered. When he saw Hamish enter, he offered a polite nod, nothing more. Hamish noticed the faint stiffness in his shoulders, resentment or lingering fear, he couldn't tell. Miss Fraser was the next thorn. She caught Hamish by the lane near the school, her scarf wrapped tight around her throat. You should know better than to listen to gossip, she said coolly. He frowned. I wasn't listening. I was investigating. With gossip, she returned, which is the same thing when it comes from this village. Hamish let that sting without reply. She turned and marched inside, shutting the school door firmly behind her. Mrs. Campbell, for her part, had vanished from her usual routines. No bustling about the Kirk Hall, no interfering with displays, no cheerless efficiency. The manse windows looked dim. Hamish knocked and waited. At last she opened the door, looking smaller than he remembered. I've resigned, she said before he spoke, from organising duties, for health reasons. Aye, Hamish said. She looked down at her clasped hands. He mocked my sister, wrote things about her baking that, well, she never got over it. I only wanted him to feel small, just once. Hamish didn't soften. Aye, well, it went farther than that. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't argue. He left her standing there, swallowed by her tidy hallway. By afternoon the frost was melting, but the village wasn't. Hamish walked back to the station, feeling the weight of too many eyes, each pair carrying a different version of blame. Some folk blamed Mrs. Campbell, some blamed Blair, some blamed Morag still. A few blamed themselves for having enjoyed the spectacle. Most blamed Hamish. He stepped into the station. The peat fire burned low, struggling but determined. Sonsie occupied his chair, curled up like royalty. Lug stretched near the hearth, tail thumping once in greeting before settling again with a long sigh. On the doorstep sat a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. No note. Inside was a single mince pie, plain, neat, unmistakably Morag's hand. Hamish set it on a plate and took a careful bite. It tasted warm and ordinary, with nothing vengeful hidden inside. He still didn't know whose old pie tin Blair had waved about from Morag's bin, but the untouched snow on the lid had proved soon enough it wasn't the stolen one at all. "You're an Egypt, Macbeth," he told himself mildly. Sonsie flicked her tail as if agreeing. Hamish sat by the fire and chewed slowly. Outside, the loch lay dark and still, reflecting nothing. Lochdu would go on, as it always did, grudges cooling, pride returning, kindness flickering in strange corners. And he would go on with it, tall and awkward, unpromoted, unpolished, picking up whatever crumbs the village scattered in its wake. The frost outside thickened again. Trouble, Hamish knew, rarely melted for good.